So, with that, I'm very pleased to have Matt Provencher here again this evening, and he is the DNR Small Forest Landowner Office Stewardship Forester for the west side of Washington. So he covers all of the west side of the Cascades in Washington State right now. He does site visits, landowner assistance for small forest landowners, and he does a fantastic job. And he'll tell you a bit more about what he does, but he's here to talk with us today about site preparation and how to make sure that your newly planted trees turn into the stand you want it to be. And with that, I will pass it off to you, Matt.
All right. So to answer your question, Liliana, Ken Bevis is the stewardship wildlife biologist. He is available for site visits as well as me. And then of course, Brendan, he's a WSU extension forester. And then can you see my screen there, Brendan? Everything looking good?
Yep, looks great.
All right. And so I'm the Western Washington Stewardship Forester. Brendan did a really good introduction there. Essentially, my role is to visit small forest landowners free of charge, no cost for my services, help them identify goals and objectives, talk about forest health, talk about wildfire, talk about wildlife, water quality, timber production, really whatever they might want to know about forestry. A big part of what I do is help people write forest stewardship plans, both as part of the coach planning course that WSU puts on, and then also part of also just cold calls. People just call me up looking for a plan. As you can see on the screen there, I cover Western Washington. There's my contact information at the top. My counterpart is Rob Leinberger in Eastern Washington. He covers all of Eastern Washington. This presentation is going to focus mostly on Western Washington. I will have a few tidbits here and there from Eastern Washington, but the vast majority of it's going to be Western Washington. So if you have property in Eastern Washington, or you're just curious about Eastern Washington, go ahead and write down Rob Leinberger's information down there. This will also show up at the end of the slides as well. And so today what we're going to talk about is vegetation management. You can see the little tree circled there. We're going to talk about, how to help our trees grow. We're going to cover a couple of different parts of vegetation management. So we're going to cover pre-planting vegetation management, which is also called site prep. Site preparation or site prep also includes a little bit of slash management. And so we're also going to talk about slash management a little bit, as well as the vegetation management. And then we'll talk about some post-planting vegetation management, including some of the decisions about when you should decide that you want to maybe release something that you have, or should you start over or otherwise alter your objectives. So firstly, why do we want to do vegetation management? What is its importance? Really, the first few years of a tree's life are some of the hardest. Those first couple of years, you got to think about it. A tree's been lifted from a nursery, it's been thrown in a bag, it's been put in a cooler somewhere, put in your pickup truck, driven out to the site, planted in the ground in an entirely new spot. Those trees are in shock, basically. The first year, they do very little growth at all. After the first couple of years, if you get 6 inches or a foot of growth, you're doing really good, and that's if you have no browse. Meanwhile, the brush grows, right? 4 to 6 feet is not uncommon for some of our brush species per year. It's vastly going to outcompete your young trees. As things are getting warmer and drier, we've seen a trend where we're having a little bit less survival. Typically, I would see when I was doing tree planting compliance for the DNR, I would commonly see 90+% survival doing 1 year survival surveys, one growing season after planting. We don't really see that anymore. And a lot of that can just be simply that it's warmer and drier, and being down near soil level is very hot, and it's a very hot and dry place to be. But this vegetation that grows can also cause problems too. And so we want to try to control that. As I said, when we're talking about site prep, we're not only talking about vegetation management, but we're also talking about slash management. Usually after trees have been in the ground, we're only talking about vegetation management, not necessarily slash management. You know, native weeds can obviously cause problems, but invasive weeds are really the big problems, right? So the picture in front of you does have some invasive weeds, but there's a lot of native stuff. A lot of those big green clumps you're seeing are big leaf maple clumps that are coming up. But invasive weeds can really crowd out native plants and trees due to their aggressive nature. They reduce habitat value for wildlife, birds, fish, insects. They reduce tree health and vigor. They reduce tree growth, they reduce timber value, or they increase the length of time it takes for you to grow large trees if you're trying to grow an old growth or a complex forest condition. Um, they can really cause a lot of problems, right? Think of the time and money that goes into planting trees, and just imagine you spending the time to either plant them yourself or find a contractor, spending the money to buy the trees or to pay a contractor, and all that for naught if your trees die because of brush. Um, and then the time, the cost to the economy itself, right? So Scotch broom itself is estimated to have maybe up to $140 million impact to Washington's economy. I'm not going to talk about specific brush, invasive or not, too much in this. I'll talk a little bit about alder and maples. Um, but there's a whole seminar coming up in a few weeks on invasive species in the woods. And so they'll probably talk about control options, specific control options for those as well. So this is more of a broad overview of site prep and vegetation management. You know, and then the question comes up, isn't brush good for a forest? Well, yeah, of course it is. Site prep and vegetation management isn't about having no brush or no shrub vegetation out there, but about controlling when and where it occurs. Again, as I mentioned, the tree planting takes a lot of time and effort, and we want to make sure that when we've taken the time and effort to do it, that we want to protect that investment and we want to ensure that our trees are going to survive. And later, when we've assured that survival, at least the best we can ensure it, then we can allow or introduce a forest understory kind of on our own terms after we've ensured that our trees are going to pull through. Again, at least the best that we can. So we're going to talk first about site prep, and we're going to talk again about slash management as part of that, and that's mostly going to be mechanical and fire. We can also manage vegetation with those as well. We're going to talk about hand pulling and slashing. We're going to talk about chemical methods of site prep. And so with site prep, we're going to talk about all those things starting now. So first thing I'm going to talk about is slash. We'll get into slash first. We'll talk about the vegetation later. The purpose of slash management is to create plantable spots as well as manage the fire loading. Um, this right here that we're looking at, there might be a few plantable spots in here. You can see down in this corner over here, the bottom right corner, there's some green popping up. So there's some places where maybe we're very near the ground where we can plant trees, but there's going to be a lot of places in there where maybe it's a little difficult to get trees. On top of that, even in Western Washington, this might be a pretty substantial fire load, fuel loading for fire for several years to come. Certainly in Eastern Washington, this is going to be a substantial fuel load. At the very least in Western Washington, though this might take a while because of how much is there, it will decompose over time. In Eastern Washington, it could look almost like this 2 or 3, 4 or 5 years after harvest. Things tend to decay a lot slower over there because of the cooler, drier environment than what we have over here. So in here, we probably could have done a little bit of slash management to create a little bit more plantable spots. So how might we do that? Well, the first thing that we can do is we can create piles, kind of like what you see in the picture here. These two piles, not sure if these are going to be burned or not. Not sure what the landowner's intention are here. If they were going to be burned, they probably could have been a little bit further apart just to try to minimize the heat so that we don't cause problems with burning the soil that we'll see in a couple of slides. If they're not going to be burned, probably a little too close together. They look like they're fairly decent size if they're not going to be burned as far as not being too huge at the base. But at the same time, because they're so close together, it's going to be hard to get trees, especially kind of between those. So you might have lost a few plantable spots. If we're not going to burn, I usually recommend maybe leaving fewer large or smaller piles scattered throughout the landscape a little bit, as opposed to these larger piles, kind of like what we see here. This was probably a landing, is my guess. You could windrow. A windrow is basically a long, narrow pile. So instead of one pile like we just saw, you have this long, narrow pile, kind of what's going on there in the picture. In Washington, we typically see that along roads where especially after a clear cut timber harvest, you have been considered to have created a extreme hazard from a fire perspective because of sparks, dragging chains, throwing cigarette butts out a window. And so you're required to pull a lot of that material back from the road in order for fire prevention. And they often end up doing windrows like this. If you're not going to burn it, windrows like this are perfectly acceptable. They often do create smaller piles, almost look like a windrow, but they're just connected, but they're all in a line if they are planning on burning it. You can have too much of a good thing when you are doing slash management. So this picture was actually for a timber harvest, not for pasture or condos. You can see that they've tended to, it looks like they've popped a lot of the stumps out in there. That's not something that's very common, something that's not necessary in forestry. They've driven that cat all over the place. They've probably compacted the soil pretty substantially. They've reduced the ability for rainwater to penetrate through that soil because of that. So they're going to have maybe increased problems with drought as well as increased erosion and runoff. They've probably reduced the site class on this, maybe one or two site classes. Site class is a measure of the soil's productivity to grow trees. So if you reduce that site class, you have a less productive site, and we want to try to avoid that in forestry. You can look at some of these piles on the left side and the right side, kind of on either side of the cat there, and you can see how the soil there looks pinkish. That probably means those piles burned really hot and burned the soil to the point where it's almost like glass. And it's going to have water's going to have a real hard time getting through those areas there. So again, we've reduced the soil's ability to infiltrate water. Trees are going to have a real tough time growing there. So all in all, this is not very good site preparation, what we're seeing here, even though planters might really love coming in here because they're not going to have to deal with hardly anything. From a forestry perspective, from a forester's perspective, this isn't a good practice that we're seeing here. And it's definitely something that we want to avoid. This is good for condos. This is good for pasture. This isn't good for forestry that we're looking at there. So if we're going to burn, I like to have small piles, kind of like what you see there on the left. That's a relatively small pile. If you have the time, if you're on site, you can feed it yourself, or you can have the logger create several small piles throughout the unit that you can burn over time. In Eastern Washington, unit burning can be common in some areas, like you see in the picture on the right there. The DNR is trying to get a prescribed burning program off the ground. They wanted to do it this year. Because of the COVID situation, they haven't been able to have it exactly where they want it. But they're hoping to give landowners a little bit more training and freedom to be able to do some of these themselves. You may see it in Western Washington in a few places. There's some places where it's appropriate not only for slash management, but also from a site prep perspective, like prairie lands that you might have seen down in Southwest Washington, maybe up in the islands, things like that, where unit burning was pretty common in the past historically, and maybe it's appropriate to have again. But in Western Washington, it's going to be a little less common, I think, than in Eastern Washington. But you don't even have to burn, right? We can mechanically arrange the slash so that we can create the plantable spots while also provide some other benefits that slash provides. Slash provides nutrients to the soil as it decomposes, so it can increase soil productivity. It can reduce soil temperatures by shading the soil, and it can increase soil moisture through that same shading. So it can be really good to provide slash on site. So don't think by any means you have to clean it up. This is an example of some good slash management. They've left light to moderate slash throughout the entire unit, as you can see there. We still have plantable spots like what you can see right there. And then up on the hill, you have that small pile, and they have several of those small piles all over the place. Those piles can act as refuge for wildlife. Ken may have some thoughts on that when we get to the questions at the end, if people have questions about that. And they are small enough that you're not giving up plantable spots, which is important as well. So this is an example of a practice that I really like to see. Though you can burn, and if you have a lot of slash, you probably should burn. It's not necessarily something that you have to do anywhere and everywhere. And so this is an example of something that maybe on your property you might be able to strive for. So getting out of slash management and going into vegetation management, here's an example of a skid steer with a brush attachment on the top. And this is appropriate for places pretty much like what you see in the picture. So it might have 6 to 8 foot tall Scotch broom or blackberries. It's an impenetrable wall. If there's trees in there, you're not going to be able to find them. And we have to wonder about the vigor of those trees. If there were trees you wanted to save in there, you probably would not be using a machine like this. But this is at this stage of this picture that we're looking at, this is about the only option that you have to really manage that brush and get it to a point where we can start planting trees. Is we just have to go in there and get it down to the ground. And you're probably not done at that point. You're probably gonna have to follow up with either some hand pulling, some additional mowing, some chemical application, things like that. But this would be an example of mechanical site prep from a vegetation perspective. So mechanical site prep from a slash perspective, using machines to manipulate the slash into piles that we're going to burn or just smaller piles that stay in the landscape. This is an example of something that would be mechanical for slash management. And again, we're talking about lots of slash, kind of like, or not slash, vegetation, kind of like what you see in the picture there. So moving out of the mechanical side of things and going into the chemical side of things, chemicals I can kind of elicit some strong reactions from people. So I just want to let people know that these are a tool in a toolbox. There's nothing that says you have to use them, but there's also different levels of intensity of chemicals, right? So here's maybe more of the industrial model, the helicopter spraying chemicals. This probably elicits negative reaction from quite a few people, and that's maybe one of the more intensive methods of applying chemicals. Here's an example of a crew that's doing a hand application of what looks to be a pre-emergent chemical with their spraying on the soil to inhibit seedling growth. You can see that they have their wands down at waist level or below, so they're really minimizing the drift and they're really making sure that they hit the target they're looking for. So maybe that's less intense than the helicopter. And then you can get even less intense than that, right? By actually targeting the actual plants that you're looking to control. So this is an example. You can see that little sponge up there on the right, the little yellow thing. That is an example of some sort of basal application where they're just trying to put chemical on the bark of that plant and it'll soak through the bark and then kill that tree. You have a cut and dab or a cut and squirt application, the picture on the right with the blue in it. That again, you've cut that, you're going to spray the cambium layer, which is only those outer few inches, right? So you don't actually have to spray the entire stump, just that outer ring, kind of like what they're doing in that picture, and that can inhibit growth. And then you have the hack and squirt method, like that picture at the bottom, where they've hacked into the tree, into the cambium, and then they're applying that chemical in the cambium, and that's going to kill that tree. And again, those are very much targeted to the actual species that you're looking to kill. If you do decide to use chemicals, remember the label is the law. So you have to read and understand the label, make sure that it's labeled for the species that you're trying to control, and make sure it's labeled for the site that you're trying to control. There are emergent and pre-emergent chemicals, as kind of the name implies. One of them you spray on vegetation to kill it. One of them you might spray on bare dirt, like in the picture, to prevent weeds from growing to begin with. And we'll talk a little bit more about those as well. Again, make sure you follow the label directions. Don't plant too soon after an application so you don't kill the trees that you're trying to plant. Or make sure you don't use it at an inappropriate time or place. Chemicals do often get bad press, right? And so, like I said, remember that they're a tool in a toolbox. You don't have to use them. That being said, forestry chemicals are probably more benign than a lot of the chemicals in other types of agriculture. Land trusts and conservation organizations use them very frequently. That Scotch Broom Symposium I went to a few weeks ago, to a group, they all used chemicals, and one of them was spraying Scotch broom in riverbeds, old river bars, and they were using an aquatic version of glyphosate in rivers because it's about the only way to get rid of Scotch broom. And so used appropriately, they can be safe and they are definitely effective. Other methods can be effective too, but they're labor intensive. But for those of you out there that just don't want to use chemicals, we have other methods that we've already talked about and we will talk about in the future. And if we put in the work, those can be very effective as well. Should you avoid chemical girdling if you are making a wildlife snag? I honestly don't think it matters. If you are creating a wildlife snag out of a conifer up here in Washington, most of our conifers don't sprout, so you don't actually have to girdle that or use chemicals to girdle that tree, right? If you just cut down to the cambium a couple inches, those conifers are going to die and you can have your wildlife snag. If you are doing making a snag out of like a big leaf maple that can sprout, you probably would need to girdle it, kind of as Brendan said. No herbicides would be fine for that, depending slightly on a product. The reason why you would do that is if you girdle a big leaf maple tree, you're going to get a bunch of big leaf maple sprouts. So if you spray the chemical on that, it's going to stop that tree from sprouting. But again, most conifers, which is typically what we're making our snags from, there's going to be no need to use chemicals for those because they're not going to resprout, at least up here in Washington. Other places there are exceptions. So if you are thinking about using chemicals, a good resource for you is that Pacific Northwest Weed Management Handbook right there. You can search by weeds in that handbook, and when you search by a particular weed, it'll bring up the different chemicals you can use, the application rates you can use, the timing that is appropriate to use it for maximum effectiveness. So it's a really good resource if you're looking to use chemicals there, and I highly recommend before you use any chemicals that you go on there and see what the recommendations are. Ensure whatever you use is labeled for the site, forest land, or forestry use. Okay, so I'm hearing that I'm having some potential volume issues. Sometimes it is good, sometimes it appears faint. If anyone else is having that, let me know. I do have, yeah, let me know if anyone else is having any problems or not, and I'll try to make sure I speak more to the mic. I tend to move around a lot, so that might be why it's a problem. So make sure whatever you use is labeled for the site, like I said. And then if you do happen to have trees, again, we're talking about site prep where you don't often have trees. But if you do happen to have trees, make sure you're doing it at the right time. Conifers are more at risk for damage or mortality during the growing season, especially when lush new growth is on the trees. Again, generally with site prep, we don't have a whole lot to worry about with that. But if you do have trees, just make sure you're watching where you're spraying and doing it at the right time of the year to minimize damage to the conifers. So like I mentioned before, there are different types of chemicals. I talked about the emergent and pre-emergent. There's also selective and non-selective. So non-selective chemicals like glyphosate and imazapyr pretty much kill everything. Selective chemicals like triclopyr or 2,4-D, as well as some others, only kill certain things. Typically, they're killing broadleaf trees and plants and not necessarily grasses. And that's appropriate in some areas. Excuse me. If you have grasses that you want to keep, I would say that if you are trying to prep the site for tree planting, don't discount the grass as a problem. Grass is a very significant competitor of young seedlings. They can really pirate the vast majority of the water on the site, and can cause you some real significant problems from that perspective. They also tend to harbor rodents like mice, like voles, things like rabbits, which like the girdle trees. And so really we want to try to control the grass as much as you can. And then remember, the label is the law, right? So we want to make sure that we're following the label instructions. You've heard me say that a couple of times. That's for good reason, because the label is the law, and we want to make sure that we're following it as much as possible. So there's a different types of application. You can do pre-emergent applications. I've kind of already talked about that when we're on bare dirt. There is a foliar application. That's like the woman in the picture there. She is spraying right on the foliage of the target species that she's looking to kill. The basal application is when you're putting chemical right on the outside of the bark of your target species. The cut and dab application is when you're going to cut a tree and then dab or squirt actually on that cut stump. And excuse me. And then your injection or hack and squirt method is when you're going to cut down to the cambium in the bark and you're going to spray in there. And we'll talk a little bit more about those coming up here as well. So here's some examples of some site prep. Um, This is, I believe this is about a 4-year-old unit. It might only be 3, but I think it's 4. The trees are being browsed a little bit, so that's causing some problems. And there is some grass coming up, and I just finished telling you how much of a problem grass can be. But look at the Scotch broom and the yellow plants that you can see in there. This is in Mason County. It is a notorious spot for getting lots and lots of Scotch broom, and this doesn't have a lot of it even 3 or 4 years after harvest. The grass is coming in. You know, if I went out here on site with one of you guys, if this was your property and you're asking me what would I do, I might say, why don't you go ahead and cut the Scotch broom while there's so few of it before it becomes a problem. I don't know at this point that I would recommend controlling the grass. Um, the types of grass, probably, there's a question, do the types of grass matter? Probably not. We do have invasive grasses that are probably worse than the native grasses, like reed canary grass, for instance. The answer to the question, can I leave some grass, is absolutely yes. Remember, we talked about this isn't about having no vegetation besides trees, but just limiting when and where it occurs. Normally, we like to see at least a 2-foot circle around the trees, clear vegetation for at least the first couple of years of life. So if you wanted some sort of happy medium between killing everything and leaving some stuff, try to leave a 2-foot spot clear around all your planted trees. And if vegetation is growing outside of that, so long as it isn't shading the trees, it's probably not going to be that big of a deal. Brendan came in with a good point. Any grass that forms that thick sod layer is particularly bad. That's what I was talking about, the sod layer that really pirates the water. Um, how do you remove the hay before planting on a clay soil? Till it's about the only answer that I have for you, really. Clay and a lot of grass can be a problem. Napalm, there you go. It's interesting that you say that, Brendan. Julie Sackett's my predecessor. She said that a landowner is having problems in Lewis County with afforesting an old field on some clay soil. He did end up burning the field, and he finally got trees to grow after the field was burned. Not only did it get rid of the grass, but he said as the field was burning, he could see the mice jumping up ahead of the flaming front, right, trying to get away from the fire. So he probably killed some of the mice, but the mice that got away no longer had a place to stay in that grass, and they had to move on to other areas. So both of those things made it better. Um, for the trees. In this case, you're not going to be burning this grass because we have trees here. I probably would not recommend controlling the grass at this point. There is a cost benefit analysis you kind of have to go through. Yeah, would getting rid of the grass helpful? Probably would, but I know this was already site prep. We've already spent some money. The trees are 4 years in the ground. If they can get above the browse, they should start to be able to compete on their own. I would probably, again, just recommend the Scotch broom removal, and then we deal with the grass and hope for the best. Here's another example. A pre-emergent was sprayed on this. So this is the first growing season. You can see virtually no vegetation right along this side of the stump, the right side of the big stump. Those 3 plants kind of up in here where my mouse is, those are bracken ferns. So there's a few ferns coming up. This is a planted tree. This over here is a planted tree. This is a planted tree. I think this is a bracken fern right here. Um, so, um, there are some trees, there is some vegetation coming up in here. Those pre-emergents probably are going to give you 1 solid growing season, vegetation free. You might have a little bit of reduced growth season 2, but probably not that much. Probably by the end of the first growing season, you're going to start to see more stuff popping up in here. Um, But, you know, these trees are having a good head start, which is what we're looking for. So this was after a fire, and this was also in Mason County, and they did a little bit of site prep on here as well. And again, this is probably 2 years post planting. The fire is 3 years old. This is probably the tree's third growing season that we're going into now. Um, and you can see again, and there's a huge Scotch broom bed right behind me. The power lines that this fire started on are right behind me. And there's not one Scotch broom in this whole spot here, and we're starting to have patchy grass, but there's not as much grass as that site that we just had before. You can see a tree right here in the foreground, not looking too great, but like I said, this is their third growing season, so hopefully we start to see a little bit of growth on them. There's another tree right up here if you can see my mouse, and that one's looking a little browsed. So again, this isn't looking too terrible. um, the grass could be a problem, but there's still lots of bare dirt out there, and we certainly haven't had any Scotch broom yet. So um, yeah, this is really good. Here's another picture of that same burn. So this was like a 60-acre fire. I was on this fire the night it started. Um, you can see some Scotch broom remnants out here in the front. So there was some Scotch broom initially out on this site, but it's all burned up, and the site prep that they have done has kept it at bay, unlike some of the pictures that we're going to see in a little bit. Um, Next, so look at some no site prep. So this is also in Mason County, and here's a unit that they didn't do any site prep on, and you can see in the background by the tree line, we have a bunch of smaller trees popping up, and that's really about the only spot that we saw trees out there. There were really no trees in other spot. My guess is maybe in that back corner. Over here, it was just a little bit shadier. Maybe the Douglas fir was able to compete a little bit more with the Scotch broom because of that, but it is basically a sea of Scotch broom everywhere else. And so you've kind of run out of options. So the camera angle that I took the picture of is standing up as high as I could with the camera over my head. So my arm extended as far as possible to get this picture. So this Scotch broom is probably about my height, maybe a little bit smaller. Um, and so it's going to be tough to come in here and spray with chemicals, right? Because you're going to have to use a lot of chemical. It's over your head. It's going to be hard to get in on it. Um, so you're probably looking at coming in here and hand pulling or hand slashing with a brush saw, or maybe even coming in with one of those skid steers with a brush attachment if you don't think there's any trees in here to salvage, and manage it that way. So this is a site down in Thurston County. The landowner here had some advanced cedar regeneration that they were looking to take advantage of, and they were hoping that some of the cedar trees along the edge of the unit would also seed in. And so they didn't do any site prep. They were just kind of relying on the seed that was already in place. And 6 years later, there's like 6 cedar trees out there and a whole bunch of Scotch broom blackberries and grasses. Um, and again, at this point, it's not a good receptive bed for seedlings. And so they're not going to get a lot of germination at this point. There's a lot of vegetative competition. And so again, with the size of a lot of this brush, using chemicals, at least initially, is probably not going to work. We're probably going to have to come in here and mow with a skid steer, or again, some sort of hand pulling or some sort of manual work in order to get this down, and then maybe use chemicals, or maybe if we don't want to use chemicals, we just stay on top of it once we get it down to a baseline and allow those trees to grow. Here's a little bit wetter site up in Port Angeles here. So we don't have a lot of Scotch broom here. There are a few invasives out there, but a lot of this is native vegetation that we're seeing here. This big clump over here is either vine maple or big leaf maple. There's lots of vine maple and big leaf maple clumps coming up in the background there. Got some elderberry up here at the front. And some ferns and things like that. So I saw lots of vegetation. What I didn't see was a single conifer tree. So this native vegetation and some invasives, like I said, there's a few things in there, but it really crowded out the vegetation and caused, or the conifers, and caused problems. There is an insect that will control Scotch broom. Yes, there are actually, I believe, a couple of insects out there that control Scotch broom. Some that eat, I think, the leaves, and some that eat the seed. They have been released in a lot of places. They are around and at work in a lot of places. The Scotch broom looks a certain way, the seed, and that Scotch broom symposium, Dave, that I went to, they actually showed pictures of how you can tell if a Scotch broom plant is infected with some of these insects out there. They can be locally important, but it didn't sound like that they were controlling what they were to the amount that it was hoping that they were hoping it would control in the long run. And a lot of the stuff that they've released it doesn't work well on Scotch brooms relatives like gorse or like French broom and things like that. And yes, excavators can work very well for doing a lot of site prep if the conditions are right, for sure. So here's a fire that had no site prep done. So this is up in Kitsap County, and this is a couple acre fires. This one isn't very huge. And you can see that the vast majority of it came up in Scotchbroom. This actually burned hot enough to kill some mature trees. This fire was in 2015. I was not on this fire, but I do know when it started. It was in 2015, and you can see that basically we have a bed of Scotchbroom, except maybe over here on the left, we have an alder. And as I pan to the left with the picture, this is panning to the left. Um, Here is a little patch of alder coming up. So there was one spot in this 2 acre fire um, where we do have some alder coming up, but the whole rest of this was just all Scotch broom. So again, without proper site prep, your sites usually get invaded with invasives, and that can be very problematic. Um, so we've talked about chemical, we've talked about some mechanical. So maybe you don't have the skid steer, maybe you don't want to use chemicals. What else do we have? So we have basically good old fashioned elbow grease, right? So here's a couple of pictures, some people doing some hard work. So I've done both of these before myself. Um, um, Here is top right. Here's a guy pulling Scotch broom. I've used those weed wrenches. They can be very effective. You do want to make sure you get out all the roots as much as you can. Um, and You want to try to minimize the soil disturbance as much as possible. You know, when you pull that root out and you disturb the seed bed, you are essentially creating a nice receptive seed bed for more Scotch broom. But I would think what the take home message I would see about these hand methods of site preparation is that you're probably never done. You're always going to have to come back in and pull the small stuff as it's coming up. Scotch broom can pull really easily when young. And so, you know, you don't necessarily need a weed wrench for a lot of the Scotch broom that you're going to pull if you can get it when it's young. Um, and so you don't necessarily have to do this except maybe after the first time or two that you're doing it. Down on the bottom left, here's a guy with blackberries that obviously didn't have a skid steer. And so he's sitting there going to town with his blackberries with a brush saw. And again, it can be very effective. You're probably gonna have to go in there and retreat it as a guy who mows blackberries with my riding lawnmower consistently. What I've noticed is that it takes a long time before you stop mowing blackberries because they keep coming back, which would be very similar to what's going on here in the bottom left. But again, what it can do is help weaken the roots, and you can do it over time so that you've repeated cuttings will finally eventually reduce the root store, the rhizomes that they have, and you will kill it. It just takes quite a while for you to get there. Um, if you're going to pull, try to pull in there small and young, like I said, before the root systems really develop fully. Always try to remove as much of the root as possible so that you get limited or no resprouting. Try to limit the soil disturbance as much as possible so you don't create a receptive seed bed, although in some cases it's going to be hard, so you're just going to have to do some follow-up work. Some other methods that you can do by hand are using barriers such as cardboard, black plastic, or geotextiles to kind of shade out plants prior to planting. It can work okay with some grasses. I've seen people do it with reed canary grass. For the most part, I don't think it's super effective. I think that there's a lot of maintenance that has to go on with these things in order for them to be effective. But if you have small areas, it certainly could be effective method is just shading them out, leave the plastic or the cardboard in place for a year or something like that. Is there any literature or for mowing blackberries to eliminate energy stored in the roots? So there's King County's handouts. The other thing that I would say is whatever plant you are looking to control, Google the plant name in the Pacific Northwest. So, for instance, if it's blackberries, do blackberry control in the Pacific Northwest. And most of the time, I can come up with some really good information specific to this area to help you control that stuff. And then
Hey,
also, yeah, go ahead, Brendan.
this is Ken. I was just going
Okay.
to add that the various conservation districts in King County often will have local, really specific handouts and information. So I just
Yes.
gave you that one little
Oh,
link
that
there.
was a link you sent. Yep.
Yeah.
Excellent. Um, Yeah, so check all that information out. The local conservation districts can be helpful. Even in other counties, the local conservation districts will also often have some information and brochures for you to help you. Wondering if you have any suggestions on how to control clover, sticky grass, and foxglove. Um, that's interesting. Maybe the other panelists at the end will talk about that. Grass and clover, again, chemical control would work really good. The foxglove, though it can take over, I've never considered that to be too noxious or at least too much of a competitor, just because it doesn't shade out a lot of things. Um, but solarizing for herbaceous weeds. So I think that's what I was talking about to some degree with the black plastic or geotextiles, where it can get really hot underneath, if that's what you're talking about, Robin, and essentially burn it. That can definitely be effective. Yeah, it just takes a lot of maintenance, and if you have a large area, that can be difficult to do. But I've definitely seen it done.
Just to chime in here for a moment, Matt. In 3 weeks, we are doing a noxious weed control webinar that's going to be getting into a lot of the more species-specific control methods here. So
Yeah,
we don't need to get into every single one this week. So tune in
yeah,
to Sasha from King County Noxious Weeds when she joins us on, I believe it's July 14th.
yeah. Um, to answer your question about cherry laurel before we keep going, yes, yes, I would try to control it if needed. Horsetail, not so much. Nope, that's a pretty wet site. And again, it's a native vegetation that I don't necessarily consider to be a huge competitor often because of where it typically grows. Okay, so that's kind of the talk on site preparation or vegetation management pre-planting. So now we're going to talk about your options after you've planted trees. And so again, this is what we're going to do after we planted and the vegetation competition has gotten out of hand. Just to review what I've talked about, remember that plant competition is that struggle to capture the limited resources or growing space on the site, the light, the water, the nutrients. Know what is competing with the desired crop trees will help you make the best decision on how we're going to address it. The level of competition, the impacts on the seedlings will vary depending on your site conditions, the seedling conditions, and the climate variations. Um, and again, we've already talked about the time and money, right? So consider the lost revenue of you buying seedlings, your planting costs, whether it's the time because you did it yourself or you paid someone else to do it. And potentially the poor financial investment that it would be if the vegetation just took it over and killed all your crop trees. So some of the advantages of doing this, it can shorten your rotation if we have a timber objective, or it can just shorten the achievement of your objectives if we're trying to grow old or complex forests, large trees, things like that. It can lead to earlier thinning, which regardless of if we have a timber objective or an older complex forest condition is something that we're going to want to do. It can reduce tree mortality. I'll have a slide on that in a couple of slides. And we're going to talk about are we going to release the crop trees that we have, or are we going to have to alter our objectives or maybe even start over? And we're going to talk about some of those decisions. So think about what you want your forest to look like when you're making these decisions. On the left, some good site prep took place. They probably did some chemicals in here. They left slash. If you look, you got piles in the background. There's some good slash that's helping to release nutrients, provide shade for a cooler soil environment and a wetter soil environment. They protected the trees that needed protected. My guess is they got some cedar in there. And this looks really good. And then look over on the right. And I have one tree that's circled, and that tree looks actually pretty vigorous. It might be able to be released. But how many trees do you see in there? I circled that one because that's the only one that I'm confident I see. There might be a few others in there, but that's the only one I'm confident I see. And then look at the size of that, right? So what are your options for managing the grass and the blackberries that are in there at this point? You could go in there and spray it, but you're going to be spraying a lot of chemicals, right? Um, you could go in there with the skid steer with the brush mower attachment on the top and just mow it down. But if you have a few of those trees, like the red one that's circled there, are you going to be able to see them? And are you going to be able to not mow them over so that you can retain those trees after you've cleared the vegetation? So maybe at this point, hand pulling or hand slashing is the only option that you have left. And so the point that I like to get across here is that early intervention gives you more options for controlling whatever the problem is. At this point, we've lost a lot of options, and we're basically probably down to one for this particular site, and that's good old-fashioned elbow grease to take care of the problem. So again, that skid steer probably isn't going to work, right? In this case, because we're just not going to see those trees. Now, if you've decided to start over, maybe it doesn't matter. We're going to mow the trees down anyways. But if you're trying to save what's there, which oftentimes in vegetation management after tree planting, we're trying to do, this skid steer is not going to be a good solution at that point. So why do we want to do release treatments at all? Well, here's a graph from OSU, Oregon State University, that kind of illustrates the point here. So on the left, we didn't do any sort of release treatment. We just let the brush grow, and you can see the brush keeps growing in height and keeps getting bigger and bigger, and your seedlings really start to decline and then even go back downhill. And that's an indicator of mortality, right? So not only are our seedlings not growing, but they're dying. Over on the right, here's an example of what happens with the release treatment. So the brush is growing, it's starting to outcompete our seedlings. We go in there, we manage the brush. It doesn't matter how we manage it, we do it. And we've brought the brush competition down. Note, it didn't go down to zero. We don't have to get it down to zero. We just have to reduce the competition on our seedlings. And that allows the seedlings to continue growing and to get in the position where they can compete effectively with the brush or the understory vegetation that you're looking to control. So when are we going to do a release versus when are we going to have to alter our objectives? Well, let's look at the stand on the left there. And I've circled a Douglas fir tree under, those are red alders in this case. And look at that Douglas fir. So the branches are kind of down. You can see the interior needles are non-existent, and the ones that are there, which might be last year's needle or maybe 2 years ago, are looking kind of brown. So we have reduced needle retention. The tree is kind of tall and skinny, so we call that a high height to diameter ratio, which means it might be a little out of whack. Doesn't have a very tall, pointy leader on it. So that tree is not very vigorous. And it's highly likely if we were to go in there and cut those alders, that those Douglas firs would not respond well to release. So you'd cut the alders and you end up with a bunch of dead Douglas firs anyways, in other words. So in the picture on the left, we may be talking about altering our objectives. Instead of managing for the Douglas fir that we planted, now we're managing for alder. And there's some things that we can do with the alder if we want to underplant other conifer species, which is for another talk. But for the most part, we're probably having to shift what we're doing from conifer to alder in that point. Over on the right, again, there's a bunch of alder in the overstory there, and I've highlighted another Douglas fir, and that Douglas fir looks a little different. It looks a lot more vigorous, got a tall pointy leader, the foliage looks nice and green. that tree right there might respond well to release. And I understand in the picture, it's kind of hard to see what's going on the right or the left, if this is just a small gap or if this is part of a larger harvest unit. But the point is that we could probably go in and slash some of those alders and some of this other competing vegetation, and we could probably release this Douglas fir to a point where it'll continue to grow well, because it's at a stage where it will respond to that. When we're slashing alder, timing is very important. Alder can resprout. So the best timing is probably that June to July time period, where we're getting about 96% mortality. As we get in, move back into May, we're at about 88% mortality. So that's still pretty good. So May is pretty good. August can be okay-ish. You're getting about 70% mortality. So if you get nothing else going on in your August and you wanted to slash some alder, you could probably do that and you'd have decent mortality. But May, July is definitely better than August. As you get into September, your mortality is going to fall to about 22%. So you're going to have 3 out of 4 alders probably resprout. So you're probably wasting your time to do it into the fall over the winter, because you're going to get a lot of resprouts. So definitely, if you're going to slash alder to try to release some Douglas firs, focus on June or July. If you're going to do it in May, it's okay. If you're going to do it in August, it's less okay, but you'll probably still do okay. And then avoid the rest of the months. As I said, right there. So what if we're going to let it go or start over, right? So we've already decided we're going to alter our objectives at this point. What are our options? Well, in the bottom right, in the top left there, we have lots of grass, lots of Scotch broom, and I don't see lots of trees. Maybe in those places, it's appropriate to start over. Kind of same with the picture in the middle, right? Where we don't have any trees to speak of at all. So maybe we come in there and spray with chemicals, or we mow, or we do some hand pulling or some hand cutting, and we get this back into a situation where we can plant some trees. In the top right and the bottom left, we have trees. They're not the most vigorous looking trees from the photos. Lots of hardwoods that are a lot shorter lived than our conifers, although they do have some good wildlife value. And because we have trees there, maybe we decide that we're going to manage what we have, and maybe we're going to decide to kind of let it go, see what grows, maybe do some understory planting of some shade tolerant trees like western red cedar, grand fir, western hemlock, something like that, to try to get an understory conifer, some advanced regeneration for when we go in and harvest the overstory of maples and alders. So these decisions are very site specific, and probably best to get some on-site consultation. So if you have something that looks like this and you have questions, probably best to give me or Brendan a call and we can help you out. When is the best time to slash 3-inch diameter cottonwood? That's a good question, actually. I don't know if Brendan, if you know, I would think that maybe it's around the same as alder. You probably want to do it in the summer months. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That would be my instinct as well. I mean,
Yeah.
any hardwood that you're trying to get not to sucker back up, do it when it's hot and the tree's stressed, and
Yeah, so I'd shoot for that June, July time period. Right after the trees have leafed out, which is typically June, July, their root stores are at their least. So for a lot of the hardwood species, if we're going to slash, that can be best. They do start to store up energy and resources in their roots as the summer goes on, which is why we start getting into September and things like that. They tend to be able to resprout. So usually after leaf out, that's why historically Scotch broom has been slashed as it's flowering, because that's when its root store is at its least. So kind of think about those aspects when you're asking the question, when should I slash something? A couple more slides here. So release treatment on big leaf maple. Big leaf maple sprouts can really come to dominate. A single stump sprout can occupy as much of a 1/4 acre of land, shading out the growing space for the trees you planted. Imagine if you planted 300 to 400 trees per acre and one of these clumps takes up a 1/4 acre. That's 75 to 100 trees that you spent the money on to buy and plant that are now likely going to die. On top of that, even though maple can have some immense wildlife value, these stump sprout trees seldom make good trees. They seldom live past 40 or 50 years. They're rubbing all against each other. A lot of them sprout in the upper part of the stump, and as the stump decomposes, they fall down. So they don't really make good quality trees in the long run for the most part. The best way to treat these is with chemicals, which I'll talk about in a sec. If you're chemical averse, usually what we talk about doing is we got to manage the clump. So what we're going to try to do is choose maybe 2 stems, maybe 3 stems out of that clump, cut the rest of them, and hope that the tree puts its energy into growing those 2 or 3 stems that you're left, as opposed to resprouting. Doesn't always work very well. You may have to come in and cut some more sprouts, but that's about the only option we have. If you are going to do that, try to find stems that are sprouts that are at the lower part of the stump, or growing out of the roots themselves. So as that stump doesn't decomposes, it doesn't just fall out. If you are going to use chemicals, there's a couple of different options. When they're small, you can do what's called a thin line application, which is a basal application. So we're putting the chemical on the bark. This works the stems up to about 1.5 inches in diameter, maybe 2 inches in diameter, when you can spray the chemical right on the bark, and it sucks in through the bark, and then it comes down and kills the tree. If it is bigger than 1.5 inches or 2 inches, the bark is probably getting too thick and that chemical won't soak through. So at that point, you're probably going to have to do a hack and squirt. When we take a hatchet, we hack into the stem, and then we spray the chemical in that hack area so it gets right to the cambium and then sucks it down. Usually we're going to do this in like February or March for the most part. I have read some stuff that it's been effective in the fall as well, although it seems like in Western Washington, when I've known people that are do it, it's February and March when they're applying the herbicide to their big leaf maple. So these are just examples of those release treatments I was just talking about. Note that none of these are actually on big leaf maple, but this illustrates the point anyways. The basal application doesn't quite look like that. We call it thin line for a reason. It's usually a thin line on the bark as opposed to that thicker part that they have there. Note how they all have blue dye. That's important so you know what you've treated, whether you're doing it yourself or whether you're hiring a contractor. Make sure they have some dye in there so you can actually see which ones have been treated. This stump treatment, again, you can see you only got to do the outer 1 or 2 inches to make it successful. You can do it on big leaf maple. If you're having a commercial logging operation, it can be difficult because you really need to do this within maybe an hour or 2 tops of the tree being cut. And if they're in there with some big equipment, you're not going to be able to get anywhere near it. But certainly if there's a maple or an alder or something that you're just cutting, you could do this yourself and prevent the resprouting. So key points here as we finish up: anticipate the challenges that you might have up front. Look and see what your neighbors have. Look and see what's growing on your property already, and that'll help you anticipate the challenges that you might have with your vegetation management needs. Even if you've done good site prep, you can't just walk away after the trees have been planted. You're going to have to check how the vegetation is going. You're probably going to have to do some follow-up care, and then be honest and realistic about your capabilities. You know, a lot of these methods that I used are very labor intensive, and just make sure that you're not biting off more than you can chew. And then open it up for questions. And there's the contact information again for me and Rob Leinberger. We're both happy to come out and visit you.
Great. Thank you very much, Matt. That was another great session. And a couple of quick announcements before we move on to questions and continue questions. Once more, just to reiterate, if you needed the teacher clock hours, if you're a K through 12 teacher, please email me. And if you need the SAF credits, continuing education credits, also please email me. And then also, like I said earlier, we're doing an invasive weed webinar on July 14th that'll go into a bit more detail on species-specific control methods. And then also the day after that, on July 15th, King County Noxious Weeds, 2 of their other instructors, are doing their own webinar. And I'm about to put a link, I just put a link into their Eventbrite registration for that. They just by chance happened to book it or put it for the day after our invasive forest weed webinar. So both of those will be good options for further information, and those they know what they're talking about over there at the King County Noxious Weed Program. So let's move on to questions. I think we covered most of the questions in the chat.
Yeah,
So
I
if
think so as well.
if you felt like we missed your question or gave an incomplete answer, please type it in again, and we'll take another crack at it. Otherwise, go ahead and ask any more questions. If you
Yeah.
have a super site-specific question, and a lot of these site prep questions are so site-specific because they depend on your soil and the species of trees you have and the species of invasive you have, you might put together a slightly more detailed email to myself and or Matt, and send some photos as well, and we can give you some better
Or Rob if you're in Eastern Washington.
yeah,
And
or Rob.
also note that Ken Bevis there put his email address. He's above the links that Brendan just put in.
Yes.
So if you have any wildlife specific questions, you can email Ken. I do see that we have a question there, Brendan. What would your preferred method be to convert an old abused pasture to a forest? That's a really good question. You are trying to do, if you're actually going to do this, one of the hardest things in forestry is to convert an old abused pasture to a forest. Remember, Brendan mentioned in the chat, and I mentioned in my talk, that grass, that sod layer is difficult. Also, if it's been a pasture that's either been hayed or if cattle are running on it, it is likely very compacted. So the first thing that you're probably going to need to do is break up that compaction layer, probably at least a foot down, right? So we're going to have to get some rippers or a tiller or something like that, and we're really going to have to turn that over so that we can break up that compaction layer, break up that grass layer. If you're not chemical averse, probably doing a little bit of pre-emergent chemical application on there too to prevent that grass from resprouting, because you can turn it and you can till it, and you're making a great seed bed for grass and every other non-invasive that wants to grow in there, right?
Yeah.
The
And
Vulcan, go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say, and Ken's point there with the vole
Yeah.
control.
Yeah, which if you're going to turn and spray the grass can be a good thing. You also saw Roxanne said raptors. So Ken talked about his predator assist. He just put a comment in there. That can work really good for getting rid of the mice, or at least help, right? But remember that the voles and the mice are only part of the problem. The compacted soil in the grass itself is probably a much more significant problem than the actual little critters that might be in there. Though, if you saw my blog on Forest Stewardship Notes just a few weeks ago, I interviewed a landowner who's had a heck of a problem with little woodland critters in their plantings, right? So not to discount those issues, but it's a very difficult thing and very difficult to be successful. What I would recommend is, if you are interested in doing that, give me a call, give Rob a call if you happen to be in Eastern Washington. NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, has funds available to help you do that and can add some additional expertise to it, because they also have specialists in agriculture as well as forestry. What spray kills grass and not ponderosa pine? It is probably best to read the label on that. The
Yes, there's
chemicals,
quite a few products. I can't remember their
yeah,
brand names off the top of my head, but there's
yeah.
quite a few grass
I
specific
Yeah, there
products.
are. And if you go to your local farm store and ask that very question, I bet you the state licensed dealer manager on site will know just what to give you, Kurt. You
Yes.
know,
And
so
just
you could
add, oh, sorry, I was just going
go.
to, before we move on too quickly, to add to your grass point, one of the very common questions that Kevin and I get with people emailing us with photos of their trees dying and top down drought, top kill, uh, almost always the tree is out in a lawn or a field surrounded by grass and sod.
Yeah,
And that's what's really exacerbating the drought stress. We can't emphasize enough that
yeah,
the grass and the trees
yeah,
and that sod layer and
yeah,
compaction, like you said, if there was
yeah,
livestock on it, they
yeah.
really don't get along.
That OSU slide that I showed you with the two graphs, somewhere when I was looking at that, OSU also had a study that showed, at least in southern Oregon, so it's a little bit warmer there, I do grant you that, by the end of June, heavy grass has dried out the upper 12 inches of soil.
Right.
Your seedlings are not going to be any deeper than that, right? So they are not going to have moisture. You can see Carol said she converted a pasture, plow it twice, right? Breaking up that compaction layer, getting rid of that grass. Can't stress that enough.
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to go back. Dave New asked earlier about biological controls on
Mm-hmm.
Scotch broom and gorse, or he asked about Scotch
Mm-hmm.
broom. I gave an answer saying I didn't know of any that were currently approved. I was wrong about that.
Yeah, there's a few
Uh,
out there.
there's a few, but they're already widespread in Washington,
Yeah,
and you still have your Scotch broom.
yeah,
Uh, biological control agents are fantastic as part of an integrated pest management
yep,
control plan, but they are almost
yep,
never
yeah.
a silver bullet.
No, no. They've probably reduced things a little bit. They probably reduced the health and vigor of the Scotch broom, and they probably kill a few plants here and there.
Right.
But yeah, plow it twice in the same year. That's a good question, and I really can't answer. My guess is that this is a long-term proposition, and you probably want to wait for things to grow back and then plow it again. If you are going to plow it twice. I don't know if you can answer that, Carol. What did you do if you plowed it twice in the same year, or if this was a multi-year conversion that you did? Normally, I've just seen it plowed once and then maybe sprayed with some chemicals. But, if you have a lot of compaction, I could see why plowing it twice would make sense. Or if you have a lot of grass, I could see why it would make sense. Yeah. Yeah. The biological controls, there's a few out there for Scotch broom and gorse and some other things like that. They're just not going to be super effective, so you're still going to have to do some other things.
I mean,
Go ahead.
I was going to say quite a few of them were introduced back in the 30s to
Yeah.
50s, and they're still out there doing their thing,
Yeah.
but they haven't made a big difference.
And an interesting tidbit from that Scotch Broom Symposium that I went to is they had the Center for Natural Lands Management there, which is a group that is highly invested in restoring some of the old prairie sites in the Puget Sound area. And they've been doing it for the better part of 30 years, and they have photos from 30 years ago when they started, so they know where the Scotch Broom was 30 years ago. And they've done 30 years of burning and spot spraying with chemicals. And even 30 years later, the places with Scotch broom, even if there's no Scotch broom present, they still have a degraded plant community in those places. There's still a lot more invasive plants and grasses in those areas. And they don't know why yet, but they're thinking Scotch broom may actually alter the soil chemistry and make it more difficult for natural stuff to grow, more than just allelopathy, which is when a chemical a plant puts out to inhibit other plants growing, but actually altering soil chemical. So and they don't know that for sure, because this is just emerging stuff that they're noticing. So don't go around saying that is what's happening, but that's just their leading theory right now. So I can't stress enough that if you have the ability to remove your Scotch broom, please remove your Scotch broom.
So I want to throw in a little habitat insight too, that phase of young forest where you can get the conifers up above the original competing brush, and then you have that emergent shrub layer while you have the little conifers. And this is like between year 7 and 15. That's actually one of the richest habitat phases in young forest that we have. So there's this kind of sweet spot where you have a lot of the native vegetation mixed with the conifers, and when you can get there, it's really marvelous.
Yeah.
Right. And getting those trees up above the Scotch broom, Carol Davis just talked about there's Scotch broom there. And in fact, I was just thinking of their property, I believe it was. You have a little section, Carol, there, where it's a perfect example right now, or at least it was a year or two ago, of the Scotch broom that was neck and neck competing with the Douglas fir, and the Douglas fir just got above, and as soon as that canopy closed, Scotch broom was brown and dead.
Yeah.
So if you can get that canopy to close above it, that is also one good solution for it.
Yeah. Another interesting thing from that Scotch broom symposium is they did a study where they planted trees on a site where Scotch broom had never existed. These were Douglas fir, and then planted trees on a Scotch broom site where they had cleared the Scotch broom. So they had gotten rid of it. And the site that previously had Scotch broom had lower survival of Douglas fir than the site without. So yeah, so that Scotch broom they're really thinking it's nastier than they thought it was. So it's definitely hard to get rid of it if your neighbors don't control their sites. I am dealing with that in my 9/10 of an acre. I've lived here 11 years and I have Scotch broom starts all the time because my neighbor has Scotch broom. So imagine how it is if you have 20 acres or 40 acres or 100 acres and your neighbors don't control it. So you're absolutely right, James. Yeah, goats or pigs?
Goats.
Yes,
Goats
sir.
are up there with
Yeah.
helicopter spraying and napalm, though, in terms of nuclear options for
Yeah,
vegetation
yeah,
control.
because they're going to kill everything, even
Yeah.
your trees.
But
Um,
I
so
actually watched an elk eating Scotch broom one time.
yeah, I've seen browse Scotch broom quite a bit. Right, when I was a state lands forester, they'll eat it, but it's not going to kill it. Right, it's just going to keep it back.
Right.
So yeah, you can do. I didn't touch on goats, but you can totally do goats as site prep. Right, again, that would be site prep pre-tree planting because they're going to kill everything. And one thing I heard, I'm not a farmer, so I don't want to say this as gospel, but goats are browsers of brush, sheep are grazers of grass. So it depends what you're
Yeah.
looking to control and what you want to get.
Right.
That is accurate.
And pigs would root up everything.
Yeah. But they're all delicious.
You like goat?
Goat's delicious. Absolutely. Place
Okay.
down the road from me does some great goat curry.
We
Interesting.
are digressing, gentlemen.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, I want to know if there's any other questions out there from anybody.
Rent a ruminant. I like it.
If you want to rent a goat, nice.
Is that a real thing, Roxanne?
I believe
Yes,
it.
it is. Okay, yeah.
Sounds legit. Yeah.
I've heard of it. There's companies they'll have the little hot fence. There you go.
Okay,
Rent a
right on.
ruminants on
Yeah.
Vashon.
Yeah. Do you know,
Yeah.
Roxanne, if they're the ones that were that owned the goats that were above the freeway in downtown Seattle quite a bit last year?
Yes,
Ah,
it
nice.
was.
Oh,
There
okay.
you go.
Nice.
Rent a
Interesting.
ruminant. I like it.
Nice. I like it.
Fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So, any other
So
questions from anybody?
so Matt, I think you need a couple cute goat pictures for this ruminant
Yeah.
assist section of your
Yeah.
presentation.
Well, I think so. Some of these slides I actually stole from the King County Noxious Weed presentation because I found it online. I tried to credit them, but I do think she's going to talk about goats. So,
And-
Yes. If
Okay.
not,
Yeah.
we can ask her to.
yeah. So,
Nice. And Liliana, I'm gonna drag Matt out there. We've got to come
No.
see your place. We got to do a
And
follow up.
to answer your question, Bob, I absolutely am available to do a walkabout. You have my contact information there on the screen. Feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call, and we'll get something on the schedule. And that goes for anybody listening. If you're in Western Washington and you have some questions, whether about site prep or your forest in general, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call. If you got wildlife questions, give Ken a call.
Yeah.
If you happen to be in Eastern Washington, give Rob a call. We're happy to help you out.
Yeah, I want to add to that Brendan and Matt and myself and Rob, our job is to help you. And if we don't know the answer, we might know somebody who does, and you might
Yeah.
know somebody. It's a pretty remarkable networking exercise. So,
Yep.
Matt, thanks for letting me help you out here, and that's good fun.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, no
thank
problem.
you for joining us, Ken.
the-
Always appreciated.
The dividing line for east-west is the Cascade Crest. So if you're west of the Cascade Crest, you got me. If you're east of the Cascade Crest, you got Ken. If you happen to be in that small little corner of Skamania County by the Bridge of the Gods and stuff like that, I still cover all of Skamania County, whether it's east or west. My office is in Olympia, but I typically work out of my house in Shelton, where I am right now. But again, I cover all of Western Washington. So even if you're not near Shelton, don't let that discourage you. I love the 4-hour drive up to Whatcom County. I love the 3-hour drive down to Skamania County. Forks is nice this time of year, and anytime I can get out to Long Beach, I'm happy. And I mean, I love Snoqualmie Pass too. So if you got land up there, give me a call.
Great.
We're
All
here to
right.
help.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to end the session here, and everyone enjoy the rest of your evening.
All right.
Nice.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Nice job, everybody. Thanks for coming.